Creepy haunted Airbnb story. You know how people always say pictures lie? That the glow of a photograph can make even the most rundown shack look like a magazine cover if the lighting's right? Well, I should have listened to that voice inside my head when I first saw the listing. The Airbnb page showed a two-story colonial house on the edge of a sleepy New England town, painted white with green shutters that seemed freshly scrubbed. The kind of place you expect Martha Stewart to live, or maybe one of those families in Hallmark Christmas movies. There was ivy curling over the porch, a red swing hanging from an oak tree, and a driveway lined with lanterns that looked like they had been plucked straight from some Rockwell painting of America at its best. And the price was too good to be true, which should have been another warning. A whole house, all to myself, for less than what I'd pay for a decent hotel room near the interstate. The host's description said, "Perfect getaway for writers, artists, and dreamers. Old house charm with modern comforts." That line hooked me. I'm a writer, or at least I tell myself that on good days. I thought, hell, this is perfect. I'll spend a week, maybe two, and finally finish that short story collection I've been dragging around like a corpse tied to my ankle. The first wrong note came the night I arrived. You know that creeping sense you get when you pull up to a house that feels wrong? Like it's staring at you, not the other way around. The pictures hadn't lied exactly, they just hadn't told the whole truth. Sure, the house was there, sitting proud against the trees, but the paint had peeled in long gray ribbons, the shutters were half-hinged and banging in the wind, and the lanterns by the driveway were cracked and dead-eyed, like missing teeth in a smile. The porch swing hung crooked, its rope frayed and nearly split, and the ivy that looked romantic in the photos was thick as a noose, strangling the gutters and clawing at the windows. I remember stepping out of my car, stretching my legs, and thinking, it smells like something rotting. Not strong enough to send me running, but faint, sour, like meat left too long in the fridge. It drifted through the evening air as if the house was breathing it out. Still, I told myself old houses smell. They creak, they sigh, they hold onto things the way an attic holds onto boxes you never open. I hauled my suitcase up the steps, keys clutched in my hand like a talisman. The door was painted red once, but the color had faded to something that looked more like dried blood. I laughed nervously at the thought, trying to shake off the unease, but when the lock finally clicked and I pushed it open, the air inside hit me with a coldness that raised the hair on my arms. Not the normal kind of cold, not drafty windows cold, but a deep, buried chill, like the kind that seeps into basements where sunlight never touches. I stepped in, telling myself it was fine, it was just an old house, and I felt the floorboards groan beneath me as though the house itself was whispering, "You shouldn't have come here." The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful, country kind of silence, but the hollow kind that makes your ears ring because you're expecting a sound that never comes. No crickets, no rustle of leaves outside, no hum of distant traffic. Just a stillness that pressed against me until I could hear the blood pumping in my head. The furniture was old-fashioned but neat, as if someone had been living there not long ago. A quilt draped over the couch, a stack of logs by the fireplace, a bowl of dried lavender on the table. All of it felt staged, the way realtors try to dress up a place before you walk in. And yet, as I moved further into the house, dragging my suitcase over the warped wooden floor, I felt eyes on me. Not from outside. From within the house itself, watching from behind the closed doors, from the upstairs landing, from the shadows pooling in the corners. I paused at the bottom of the staircase, gripping the rail, and told myself it was nerves. A long drive, a stranger's house, and a writer's overactive imagination. That's all. I carried my bag up to the second floor, the steps groaning under each footfall, and chose the master bedroom at the end of the hall. It was big, with lace curtains, a four-poster bed, and an antique dresser with a cracked mirror. The mirror caught me as I set my bag down, reflecting me in a warped, funhouse way, like the glass itself didn't want to show me right. And though I told myself I was imagining it, I swear to God, for just a split second, I saw something else in that glass. Not my face. Not exactly. A woman maybe, standing just behind me, her mouth open as if to scream. But when I spun around, the room was empty. Sleep didn't come easy that first night, though I told myself it would. I thought, A hot shower, a good book, I'll knock out before midnight. But the shower barely worked, just a sputter of lukewarm water that smelled faintly metallic, like rusted pipes, and the book I brought sat untouched on the nightstand because every time I tried to focus, the house made itself known. It creaked. It shifted. Somewhere in the guts of the place, a door clicked shut, though I knew I was the only one inside. At first I convinced myself it was nothing, the natural settling of wood and nails, but the rhythm of it wasn't random. It had a pattern, a cadence. 2 slow creaks, pause, 1 sharp crack. Like footsteps. And always, just outside the bedroom door. I lay under the quilt, the fabric heavy as a body draped over me, and stared at the ceiling while the noises worked themselves into my skull. I've stayed in plenty of places before, dingy motels, rented cabins, even my ex's family farmhouse up in Vermont where rats ran the walls at night, but this was different. This wasn't animals in the walls or pipes rattling. This felt intentional, like someone or something was pacing the hall, waiting for me to open the door. At one point, around 2 a.m., I sat up and whispered, "Hello," into the silence. No answer. Just the sudden faint smell of that same sour rot I'd noticed outside, drifting under the door like smoke. I pulled the quilt tighter around me and willed myself to sleep, though it was the kind of shallow half-sleep where your body rests but your brain keeps watch. Sometime in the night, I dreamed, or maybe I didn't dream at all. That's the part that rattles me even now. I saw the bedroom door swing open slower than a person would, and the hallway stretched out beyond it like it wasn't a hallway anymore but a tunnel, black and endless. And from that blackness, something crawled. Not walked, not floated, crawled. I couldn't make out its shape, only that it was low to the ground, jointed wrong, and it moved with a jerky rhythm that scraped against the silence. I remember trying to scream, but in the dream, if it was a dream, my voice caught in my throat. The thing dragged itself halfway into the room before I woke, heart hammering, the quilt tangled around me like it had tried to pin me down. The door was closed. The hallway was normal. But I swear the air was colder, heavy with that smell of rot, like the dream had leaked into the waking world. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up in bed with the lamp on, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. Morning finally came, gray and thin, bleeding through the lace curtains, and I told myself I'd laugh about it later. First night jitters. An overactive imagination. But when I went downstairs to make coffee, I noticed something that made the hair on my neck stand up straight. The bowl of lavender on the kitchen table, the one I'd seen when I first came in, wasn't lavender anymore. It was black. Not wilted, not dried out, but black, brittle as ash, as if it had been burned in a fire that hadn't left smoke or scent behind. I touched one of the stems and it crumbled to dust between my fingers. I thought about leaving right then. I even pulled out my phone to check for hotels in town. But stubbornness is a hell of a thing, especially when you're a broke writer who convinced himself this was a perfect getaway. I told myself, don't be stupid. It's a weird house. Old houses are weird. You'll spook yourself out of your own shadow if you let it. So I stayed. I made the world's worst cup of coffee in a stained Mr. Coffee machine that probably hadn't been cleaned since the 80s, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the dead lavender while trying to convince myself it was normal. But the house didn't let me pretend. Because that morning, while the weak sun barely lit the yard, I caught movement outside the window. Not a bird, not a squirrel. A face. Pale, pressed against the glass, watching me from the other side that I froze when I saw that face. It wasn't pressed hard against the glass, not enough to fog it with breath, but close enough that I could see the faint outline of eyes and the pale suggestion of skin, blurred by the morning light. For a split second I thought maybe it was a trick of the glass or the way the ivy curled along the outside frame. But then it moved. A slight shift, like the head tilted to one side, studying me. My stomach turned to ice water. I pushed the chair back so fast it scraped the floor, and in that instant, the face was gone. Just gone. I rushed to the window, fumbling the curtain aside, and found nothing but the yard outside, the swing swaying gently though there was no breeze, the oak tree casting its long shadow across the wet grass, the driveway empty except for my car. No footprints in the mud. No sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I stood there a long time, trying to reason it away. For reflection, maybe. A shadow. My own mind playing tricks after a sleepless night. That's what I told myself, but deep down, I felt the truth like a splinter lodged under the skin. Somebody, or something, was watching me in that house. And it didn't want me to leave. Not yet. I tried to go about my morning like normal. Ate a granola bar. Washed the single mug in the sink. Set up my laptop at the dining table. Writing was the whole point of this trip, after all, and damned if I was going to let some bad plumbing and creaky boards ruin that. But the words wouldn't come. Every time I started typing, I'd catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting that pale face to return. My fingers hovered over the keys, useless. The house was too loud in its silence. Too heavy. It pressed down on me like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. By midday I'd given up and decided to explore the place. Maybe if I familiarized myself with every nook and cranny, I could trick myself into feeling comfortable. I started in the living room, then moved through the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of dust and mildew. There was a parlor with a piano, its keys yellowed and chipped, a thin film of dust over the lid except for one spot, as though someone had touched it recently. My hand hovered there, wanting to test a note, but something inside me recoiled at the thought. The house was too quiet already. I didn't want to hear what kind of sound that piano might make. I climbed the stairs again and tried the doors I hadn't opened the night before. Most of the rooms were empty, just bare wooden floors and peeling wallpaper with faint outlines where pictures once hung. But one door, the one at the very end of the hall opposite my bedroom, was locked. I jiggled the handle, leaned my shoulder against it, even crouched to peek through the old-fashioned keyhole. That was a mistake. Through that keyhole, I saw an eye staring back at me. It was there for no more than a second, but that was long enough. Wide, unblinking, bloodshot. A human eye, but not alive in any way that made sense. I stumbled backwards so fast I nearly lost my footing on the stairs, heart hammering like it wanted to burst out of my chest. The hallway seemed to shrink around me, the shadows darkening even though it was midday. I told myself it couldn't be real, that my imagination had finally run wild. But I'd seen it. The clarity of that bloodshot eye burned behind my own eyelids every time I blinked. I didn't go near that door again. Not that day, not that night. But the knowledge of it sat heavy in my gut, a weight I couldn't shake. Someone, or something, was behind that locked door. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the master bedroom again. I tried, God knows I tried. I brushed my teeth, changed into clean clothes, and even left the lamp on, but every time I glanced at that cracked mirror, I saw that flash of something else. A shadow just behind my shoulder, a pale hand where no hand should be. Maybe it was a trick of the glass, maybe it wasn't, but I couldn't shake the image of that warped reflection, the woman's mouth stretched wide, frozen in a silent scream. My nerves were shot. Around midnight, I gathered the quilt and pillow and carried them downstairs like a child sneaking into the living room after a nightmare. I stretched out on the couch, telling myself the ground floor felt safer. At least down there, the locked door wasn't just across the hall. But safer isn't the same as safe. The house never slept. I realized that sometime after I killed the lamp and tried to force my eyes shut, the silence wasn't silence at all, it was listening. I could feel it pressing against my ears, like a seashell with the ocean trapped inside. And underneath that, faint but steady, came the sounds. The whisper of feet on floorboards, the hush of breath sliding through vents that hadn't rattled before, the low murmur of voices too distant to make out but close enough to know they weren't mine. I buried my head under the quilt, heart racing, every muscle taut as a drawn wire. For hours, I lay there, caught between waking and dreaming, listening to the house breathe around me. At some point, I must have dozed because I woke to the weight of something pressing against my chest. Heavy, immovable, pinning me down. My eyes snapped open and the first thing I saw was the ceiling above me, warped by the shadows of branches clawing at the window. But there was something else, darker than the dark, hunched over me. It didn't have a face. Or maybe it had too many faces. The details shifted, melted, like my eyes couldn't focus on it. All I knew was the cold. It poured off that shape like a flood, so deep it stole the breath from my lungs. I tried to scream, but the sound never left my throat. I was drowning in silence, choking on it. My arms flailed weakly, but the weight pinned me, crushing, suffocating, until the edges of my vision began to pulse with black. And then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. I sat up gasping, dragging air into my chest like a man who'd nearly drowned. The quilt had slipped onto the floor, and the room was still empty. My hands shook as I fumbled for the lamp, flooding the space with a pale yellow light that did nothing to drive away the shadows. The clock on the mantel read 3:07 am, the kind of time people whisper about, the witching hour when the world feels thinner, when the things hiding in corners slip loose. I didn't sleep again. I sat on that couch with the lamp burning until dawn bled into the windows, too rattled to move. When the sun finally rose, spilling weak light into the room, I told myself I had two choices: pack up and leave, or stay and face whatever was inside this house. Any sane person would have chosen the first. But writers, real ones, the stubborn, foolish kind, aren't always sane. There was a story here. I could feel it, gnawing at the edges of me, daring me to stay. I thought, if I can just understand it, maybe I can use it. That was the hook. That was the mistake. Because the house wasn't offering me a story. It was feeding me to one that morning light didn't banish the fear the way I hoped it would. If anything, it only made the house feel more wrong, because daylight stripped away excuses. At night you can tell yourself it's shadows, it's nerves, it's a dream leaking into reality. But in the morning? In the clear, pale sun? If something feels wrong then, you have to admit it's real. I shuffled into the kitchen, hollow-eyed, poured myself another cup of metallic-tasting coffee, and sat staring at the table. My laptop sat open, cursor blinking in a blank document. I should have left right then, slammed the lid shut, tossed my bag in the car, and driven until the house was a distant smear in the rearview mirror. But instead I stayed. Part of it was stubbornness, part of it was money, but the biggest part was the pull. That house had its hooks in me, and I didn't even realize how deep they'd sunk. I decided I needed answers. If the house had a history, and of course it did, every place that feels haunted does, maybe I could ground what was happening in facts instead of phantoms. So I drove into town, a 20-minute ride through winding roads that cut through bare trees and fields where scarecrows leaned like drunks against fence posts. The town itself was small, just a scattering of clapboard buildings around a green with a cracked fountain and a war memorial no one seemed to visit. I found a diner and ordered black coffee and eggs, more for the excuse to sit and listen than to eat. And sure enough, people talked. The old woman behind the counter asked where I was staying, and when I told her, her face went flat as a nailed board. She said, "That place out on Mill Creek Road?" I nodded. She tightened her mouth and muttered, "Should have been torn down years ago." When I pressed, she just shook her head and poured more coffee, like she'd already said too much. But later, in the library, one of those little brick buildings with dust thick enough to choke a lung, I found more. Newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, tucked into a local history binder. A headline from 1954, "Family of 4 found dead in home, authorities baffled." Another from the late 70s, "Local woman vanishes without trace." And the strangest, from just 10 years ago, "Airbnb guest disappears, police investigation ongoing." Each story was vague, lacking detail, as though someone had gone out of their way to sand down the sharp edges. The family in the 50s were found peaceful, as if asleep, no signs of violence. The woman in the 70s walked out one evening and never came back. The Airbnb guest, a man from Boston, left belongings behind, but no evidence of foul play was found. Each case closed, each file forgotten, but they all had one common thread: the house. My house. The one I was still paying to stay in. I should have left right then. That's the refrain that beats in my skull when I think back. I should have left. But I didn't. Instead, I photocopied the articles, stuffed them into my bag, and drove back to Mill Creek Road like a moth fluttering closer to the flame. The house stood waiting, hunched against the sky, its shutters clapping in the rising wind. The swing hung still. The air reeked faintly of rot again, stronger this time, as if the house had caught my scent and was exhaling to let me know it hadn't forgotten me. That night, I read those clippings by lamplight in the living room. My hands trembled as I flipped the brittle pages, but my mind was clear, almost feverish. The words burrowed into me. Family's gone. A woman vanished. A guest swallowed whole. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. And I was its next meal. I didn't think I'd survive another night, but morning came anyway, pale and gray, leaking through the curtains like dirty water. My body felt like it had been beaten, every muscle aching, my head throbbing from the hours of terror and sleeplessness. So I stayed. Looking back, I can't tell you why. Maybe it was shock. Maybe the house had already sunk its claws so deep into me that leaving wasn't an option anymore. I went through the motions, brushed my teeth, splashed cold water on my face, choked down stale cereal, but everything felt hollow, unreal, like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life. By afternoon, I couldn't take the tension anymore. The locked door upstairs had become an obsession. Every creak of the ceiling above me drew my eyes. Every groan of the walls seemed to echo from that direction. I tried to write, but the cursor blinked on a blank screen, mocking me, as though the house itself wouldn't let me put down a single word until I gave it what it wanted. And what it wanted, I knew, was for me to open that door. I told myself it was just a room. For walls, maybe an old trunk, some dust. Nothing more. I even convinced myself I'd feel better once I saw it, that I'd laugh at my own paranoia. So just before dusk, I grabbed the ring of keys the host had left in a little ceramic bowl by the door. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight, and stood before the locked door. The air there was colder, heavy, like standing in front of a freezer. I tried the first key. It didn't fit. My hands shook so badly I dropped the second one. The third slid in. For a moment I hesitated, the metal cool against my fingers, and thought, don't. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, pushed me on. I turned the key. The lock clicked. The door shuddered like it was breathing. And then it swung inward. The smell hit me first. Not just rot this time, but something worse, sweet and sick, clinging to the back of my throat. The room was dark, blinds drawn tight, but even in that dimness I saw shapes. A chair tipped over. A mattress stained with something black and crusted. And in the center of the floor, scratched deep into the wood, a circle of symbols I couldn't recognize, burned into the grain like someone had carved them with fire. I froze in the doorway, bile rising in my throat. The air felt thick, like walking into a place where 1,000 people had breathed their last. The shadows seemed too dense, moving at the corners of my vision. And then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, pale and wavering, pressed against the walls like reflections on glass. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, eyes wide and hollow, as if begging for release. One face I recognized instantly from the photocopied newspaper clipping stuffed in my bag, the missing Boston man. His mouth worked silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and that's when the door slammed shut behind me. The bang rattled the walls, plunged me into total blackness. I screamed, groping for the knob, but the metal burned my skin, hot as a stove. The faces in the walls twisted, mouths stretching wide, and then the whispers began. Not one voice but dozens, a chorus of murmurs that rose and fell, threading through my skull until I thought it would split. My name over and over, drawn out into a chant. Come. 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 Something moved in the circle on the floor. At first it was just a ripple, like heat rising off pavement, but then it bulged upward, forming shape, limbs bending wrong, head lolling unnaturally. I couldn't look directly at it. Every time I tried, my eyes slid away, refusing to focus. The whispers grew louder, the faces pressed closer, and that thing in the circle crawled toward me, dragging itself across the boards with a sound like nails on bone. In blind panic, I threw myself at the door. This time the knob turned, scorching my palm, and the door flew open with such force it slammed into the wall outside. I bolted down the hallway, down the stairs, lungs burning, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't stop until I reached the living room, collapsing onto the couch, chest heaving. Behind me, the house was silent again. The whispers gone. The banging ceased. Only the echo of my own heartbeat filled the room. But I knew the truth then, as sure as I've ever known anything. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a trap. And now that I'd opened the door, I wasn't just a guest anymore. I belonged to it.